Now let's talk about how we keep the pot small. In another section, I explained that you're often better off checking the flop with drawing hands so you don't bet yourself off the draw. Obviously, if you only do that when you have a drawing hand, your opponents will be able to figure you out very easily. Luckily, there are other situations where it might be a good idea to check the flop as well. Sometimes when you flop a monster hand and are looking to trap, but also situations where you have a piece of the flop but not a big enough piece to feel great about your hand. Let's look at a few examples. You raise before the flop with king 9 of hearts and the big blind called you. The flop comes 10, 9, 8, giving you middle pair. This is an extremely dangerous flop for your hand, which would lead many to believe that you should be aggressive and look to protect your hand with a big bet here. I don't think that's a very good idea. You could very easily be beat on the flop. Even if you are ahead, there are drawing hands out there that wouldn't be afraid to play a big pot with you. If your opponent had king jack, jack 9, any sort of a flush draw, he'll at least call a bet on the flop. By checking the flop, you give yourself an opportunity to avoid losing any chips unnecessarily, while keeping the pot small so you'll have a better chance of protecting your hand on the turn. For example, if the turn card is a deuce of diamonds and your opponent checks again, well, now you can make a decent-sized bet to force your opponent into either taking a bad price by calling or letting go of the draw. Let's look at a few more examples. You raise with pocket queens and the button calls you. The flop comes king, king, 4. There's little reason to bet here. If your opponent has the king, you're just dead meat. If not, the only hands you need to worry about are pocket 4s and pocket aces. What's even more likely, though, is that your opponent has a maximum of 3 total outs against you. If he has, say, ace-jack, you'd be giving him a free chance to outdraw you if he hits the ace. That's not such a big deal. Or, if your opponent has a hand like pocket 9s, you might be giving him a free shot and one of the 2 remaining 9s to beat you. Again, a very low percentage hit for him. The queens are strong enough on a flop like this where it's okay to play it weak on the flop, since if the queens are good on the flop, they'll likely be good at the river. If you are beat, you want to cut your losses. The other key benefit of checking the flop here is that you'll give your opponent an opportunity to either bluff off his money or protect what he believes to be the best hand. If he does have, say, pocket 9s, he'll probably bet the flop in order to protect his hand and look to find out where he is at in the hand. Now, there's no need for you to get frisky against the bet here. You should totally shut down and go into defense mode. I'm going to steal a quote from another top pro, Lane Flack, who says, "Why do the pushing when the donkey will do the pulling?" The texture of the board says a lot about how you should play marginal hands after the flop. Let's look at another example. A weak player limped in from middle position. So you decided to raise him from the button with ace-8 of spades. That player called and the flop came ace-6-6. If the limper checked to you, what would you do? You have aces up on the flop, which looks good, but what type of hands will your opponent call you with on a flop like this? One with absolutely no draw present. There is an outside chance that he'll call you with a pocket pair if he's truly awful, but more likely than that, if he calls your bet on the flop, he'll have at least an ace as well. Your 8 kicker could be in big trouble, and even if it isn't, chances are that by the river you'd be splitting the pot with your opponent. Any ace, 6, 7, 9, 10, jack, queen, or king would nullify your kicker completely. Why not check? What is the real danger in checking this flop? The only real danger is that your opponent has a hand like pocket 3s and catches on the turn. You'd be losing a pot you would have won with a bet on the flop. That's simply not going to happen often enough to make you worry about it too much. If you check the flop, you may once again induce a bluff from your opponent. Let's say the turn is a 9, for example, and your opponent has pocket 7s. He may put you on a pair of queens or kings and try to represent the ace on the turn with a bet. If he does that, once again, there is no reason to raise him here. He just might have you beat, and if not, your risk in giving him a free card is likely very minimal. The key reason you're able to check a flop with a marginal hand is that a bet on the flop likely won't change the outcome of who wins the hand. In the first example, any player with a drawing hand will likely call a bet anyway. In the other examples, there are very few cards that could outdraw you on the turn of the river. Let's look at one more example. A tight player raises from under the gun, and you are the only caller from the button with pocket 10s. The flop comes 8-4-3. Now the tight player checks to you. Here you should bet for several reasons. 1, you have position, and a bet will help define your opponent's hand. 2, your opponent likely has ace-king, and by checking, you'd give him a free chance at 6 cards to beat you. 3, there's a flush draw present. If your opponent has ace-queen and you check the flop, he could now catch an ace or queen to beat you, but also could pick up a flush draw on the turn if another heart hits the board. If a tight player check raises you on the flop, it's a pretty safe bet that your pocket tens are no good. Even if he just check and calls a bet on the flop, you should proceed with caution. He could still be trapping you with aces, waiting to trap you on the turn. With pocket tens, you basically want to make your case for the pot right on the flop. But if there is too much resistance, you need to seriously think about letting the hand go. If your opponent is brave enough to check raise you on the flop with the ace-king of hearts, so be it. By the way, even with that hand, he'd still be the favorite. 2 overcards and a flush draw is a 55% favorite. Here are some simple guidelines for how to go about mixing up your play on the flop when using the small ball approach. 4 scenarios when you want to bet. 1, when you miss the flop entirely but also have position, you should still bet the flop if you feel like your opponent also missed the flop. Be wary of flops that contain 2 or more cards above 8. Flops like Jack 9-7, Ace Queen 9, Jack 10-4 hit a lot of hands that many opponents will call with. 2, you should bet the flop with good hands that also need protection. If the flop comes Jack 8-4 and you have King Jack, you should bet the flop a high percentage of the time. 3, you should bet monster drawing hands in order to either steal the pot on the flop or look to build a bigger pot for when you hit your hand. 4, anytime you pick up a tell and feel as though your opponent is going to fold and you have a marginal hand, you should bet. For example, if the flop comes Jack 6-4 and you have 4-5, you should bet that flop if it looks like your opponent is legitimately disinterested in the hand. Here are 4 scenarios where you'll want to check. 1, when you have a drawing hand and want to catch it cheaply. If you bet the flop, your opponent may raise you, thus forcing you to lay down a drawing hand that could have potentially won you a big pot. 2, you should often check on flops that pose little danger of outdrawing your hand. If you have pocket aces and the flop comes deuce-deuce-9, there is little danger in giving away 1 free card. If your opponent has a hand like king-queen, you might win more money from him if he catches a pair on the turn. The risk of checking here is minimal. 3, if you have a marginal hand on a dangerous board, it's often better to check the flop and see what develops on the turn before committing any more chips to the pot. You can even do this with strong hands. For example, if you have pocket nines on a flop of 9-10 Jack with 2 of a suit, checking wouldn't be a bad idea at all. If the turn card is a 7, 8, Queen, King, or a flush card, you could limit a loss that may have been inevitable. 4, when you pick up a tell on your opponent that leads you to believe that he's hit a big piece of the flop and you have nothing, pay close attention to your opponent's behavior and you can save some bets in situations that would otherwise be automatic betting situations. Flops like King, King 4, Ace 6-6, Queen, Queen deuce, and Deuce, Deuce 3 are what I like to call hit or miss flops. If you started with the best hand, it will remain the best hand after flops like these a high percentage of the time. Your opponents will either hit those flops big or they will completely miss. By playing your marginal hands cautiously after these types of flops, you'll be able to minimize your losses without taking a major risk of losing the entire pot.